Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session at this Supporting Dyslexia in the Workplace event, Dyslexia Box, supported by the British Dyslexia Association. Can I just check that people can still hear me? There's a little hands up button on that control panel for our delegates. If some of you can just press it, just so I know that people can hear me, that's most appreciated. Thank you very much. It's good to get a bit of feedback. So welcome to the session. Of course, we've got with us we've got an amazing array of speakers. We've already listened this morning to Michael Vanesh from Microsoft. We now have, of course, we're with us Gillian Ashley from the British Dyslexia Association. But first, if you don't know what Dyslexia Box is, Dyslexia Box is that all-round pan-disability company supporting with technology, training, assessment, and coaching as well. We're there to support you in your needs in the workplace around all disabilities, not just dyslexia. So do get involved and have a conversation with us if you want to. Like I said, an amazing array of speakers. We don't have a picture of Gillian, we just have the BDA logo, but of course we have Gillian now, Gillian Ashley, who's the Chief Development Officer of the British Dyslexia Association. I'm really looking forward to listening to Gillian speak today, and of course straight after this one at 12 o'clock we've got Dan Thomas from Philips, and then we've got lots of other people, Richard and Ed from TalkType. We've got oh, I've missed off the time there at 14. There it is. 14. We've got Mike, a few other people from. I'll update that. Loads of other people coming, including Donna from the BDA, and of course we're finishing with Claro. So I'll update my slides before the next session. If you want to get involved and understand what Dyslexia Box is doing, just go to our website or email hello@Dyslexia Box. So I'm going to unmute Gillian. How are you, Gillian? Are you all right?
Yes, I'm very well this morning, Aaron. Thank you.
That's good. So I'm just going to now swap over to your screen. Do you want to click on share my screen for me, please? Yeah. That's brilliant. If you want to start your PowerPoint in the normal way, and then I will then be quiet and hand over to Gillian to talk about today's talk. Over to you, Gillian.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for giving up some of your time this morning. I really appreciate it. Just a little kind of word of warning before we start. Sometimes I'm environmentally challenged in my home because I've got 2 dogs, and I do actually try my very hardest to stop them from woofing, but occasionally a woof happens. So if that does happen, my apologies at this point. But I'm delighted to be here this morning to talk to you. And it's really given me a lot of food for thought as I was preparing what I was going to say to you. But before I start, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I started my career in teaching, as many of us in the dyslexia world do. And I did an unusual degree. I did a Bachelor of Education Honours across 2 key stages. So I actually qualified to teach in both primary and secondary. I took some time out to have my children, and when I came back into working as a teacher, I went into secondary from starting in primary, and that started my general journey through the area of SEND. And I went in as a special needs teacher. I became a SENCO, and I worked in a variety of settings in South London, and I did pretty much all of my teaching in London. And I did it in the 90s and the noughties when we had the London Challenge. So in many ways, it was a really exciting time. I decided then that I wanted to specialise in dyslexia, and I did an MA, and I set up my own business where I was assessing and providing bespoke training. And I've also worked at the University of Chester as a lecturer, so I've taught at university level also. I became a trustee at the British Dyslexia Association about 3 years ago, and it was really exciting to be on the cutting edge of what was happening next in the world of dyslexia. I really enjoyed it, and that really fed my way into working with the British Dyslexia Association, which I'm immensely proud of. So enough about me. I'm going to move on to the most important thing, and that is talking about supporting dyslexia in the workplace. I want to talk to you a little bit about education, because in a way we end up in a workplace with some of the stuff that has happened to us as we've progressed through education. And I've just put some facts up there for you to look at while I'm speaking. I'd like to really say to you that the the background to education is a rosy one, but it really isn't, although there have been some great moments. And I'll talk you through some of those great moments. In 2009, we had the Rose Review, and that was a really pivotal moment because in that one document, it really clearly laid out, and it's very relevant today. And whether you're in education or not, I would really strongly suggest you read it. It's got some great tips in there. And basically, the Rose Review had some recommendations in there. And one of them was that all schools needed a dyslexia specialist teacher. And so there was a big drive in education to train people to take on those roles. So at that point, from 2009, for about 5 years, it was very, very exciting because lots of things were happening in the world of dyslexia. And schools had a much better understanding, a much better awareness of what dyslexia was and how to provide for dyslexia and to support learners with dyslexia in a school setting. So it was very exciting. We've kind of slumped from there, sadly, because it's known to everybody. It's not big news, but education, along with a lot of other services, has been starved of funding. And when you're a school and in that situation, you have to make some very tough choices. And some of those choices that schools have made have been that they have cut their dyslexia provision. And although on a level I understand it because they are tough choices, what happens is that leaves families in a situation where very often they're having to fund assessments for themselves. And therein lies a problem because we then develop an exclusive system. And in that exclusive system, it's those that can afford an assessment and those that cannot. And if you can't afford an assessment, then you're cut off from a diagnosis and potentially all the services that you could engage with. I don't want to do schools a disservice because many of them excuse me, continue to fund assessments, and they see that as really important for their learners. And it is really important because what it gives us is a really good picture of what the learner's strengths and weaknesses are. And we need to understand that because we need to know how best we can provide. Sadly, the cost of the system failing falls back on the child because as they progress through school and possibly onto FE or HE without a diagnosis and with a lack of support, then that has a cost to them with regards to perhaps their mental health, the jobs that they go on to engage in, and also for them to be able to really realise their best potential. We all need support. I mean, that's the reality, but there is specific support that young people with dyslexia need. So many schools, and again, I don't want to do a disservice to schools because they really try hard. And many schools provide really good interventions for children in primary school, and they try to address the issues around reading and writing, which are what make it specific. So that's what presents at the behavioural level. And secondary schools, I've seen many secondary schools now really coming on board and really trying to address that ever increasing gap for young people. And within that, we've also, as teachers, and I include myself in that, included more in our own vocabulary. So we've included things like the word processing, and I hear that often in schools now, but what does that really mean? So very quickly, because I can't go into the ins and outs of processing, but very quickly, processing can be verbal or visual. So it's basically taking in what we've seen or heard and making sense of it in our brains. And when we look at a sign, for instance, we convert that into an understanding of what that sign means. Or maybe we look at a sign and we don't convert it because we don't know what it means. But if we process slowly, then this has got an effect on our reading and our writing. It can affect how we take in instructions, how we carry out a task. So in a school or a workplace setting, processing is something which is happening all the time. We're processing through our senses, so smells and what we touch, and it's quite easy for us to become overloaded. Another word that's commonly used now in school is the working memory. And really, it's a relatively new concept for schools. The Education Endowment Foundation produced a really good series on metacognition, which is a toolkit really of accessing your working memory. But in a workplace and in a school setting, we have to enable our employees or our young people to understand how best they work and how best they learn, and how can they transfer those strategies into other work situations. And that's really a key. So metacognition, if it's new to you, go and have a look at it, because it's a really good way of familiarizing yourself in understanding that transfer of strategies. So enough about schools. The one thing that I would say about schools is often what we see in people in a workplace is a consequence of what has happened to them in their school life. So I've put up really something that seems quite dramatic, but I've put up the symptoms of trauma. And this is not really connected to trauma, but I just want to tell you a little story about my son. So recently my son said to me he thought he was dyslexic, and he gave a really good rationale of why he thought he was dyslexic. And I listened and thought, yep, sounds like dyslexia. So I immediately jumped into action, as parents do, and said, let's go and get you assessed. And to my surprise, he said, no, I don't want to have an assessment. So I said, why? Why wouldn't you want to know? I mean, why wouldn't you? And he said, because if I get assessed and I'm dyslexic, I will never be employed. I'll never get a job. And that really stayed with me, because, you know, that feeling that you could be really compromised in your future employment is something that our young people carry through with them as they move into the workplace. And it does have an effect on self-esteem. So the BDA, the British Dyslexia Association, is the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on dyslexia and other specific learning difficulties. And it's a really fantastic role that we play, because we work very closely with Sharon Hodgson MP, who chairs it, and Lord Addington, who's an advocate for us and a voice in the House of Lords and is dyslexic himself. And in 2019, there was a big focus in the all-party parliamentary group on the human cost of dyslexia. And there is a document that you can all access, and it is called The Human Cost of Dyslexia. And in there, we had a speaker, Penny Aston, from the group's Dyslexia Aware Counselling, and she talked about trauma. And that's why I've put those symptoms up there for you. And the importance about dyslexia is that at its basic behavioural level, we see a difficulty with reading and writing. And why that's important for us to really think about is they are forms of communication. We use them all the time. When we go to the shops, when we fill out forms, when we use the internet, and most importantly, when we go to school and when we work. So by the time our young people come into a workplace, it is probably likely that they've had years of failing in an education system that hasn't served them well. Some of them who are fortunate have had extra support that their parents have been able to provide, and some have gone to schools that have been really great and put in place very effective interventions. But more often than not, that's not the case. And really, I just want to say we should applaud our young people for getting up every day and going back into a situation where they fail on a daily basis, multiple times a day. Because could we do that as adults? Could we go into our workplace and fail and fail and fail? Or would we just leave and get another job? most likely we would. We'd leave, we'd say, this is not for me, I'm moving on, and we'd get another job. But our young people can't do that. They're in a system which isn't always working for them. And it's likely that you've got people in your workplace who have suffered that trauma of being dyslexic and having a lack of support and a lack of understanding that they needed whilst in education. So in many ways, dyslexia is considered to be one of the easiest specific learning difficulties to understand and support. And that's because we think of it primarily, or in many cases only, as a difficulty with reading and writing. But in actual fact, it's much more than that. And the awful feelings of failure and embarrassment of taking down the wrong instructions when it's obvious that everybody in the workplace are copying down the right ones or listening and taking in the right ones, can quite easily take people in a workplace back to a situation where they've got some unresolved issues around dyslexia from being a child. And often it's because those unresolved issues are sitting, the feelings of them are sitting just beneath the surface as an adult. And I'm just going to tell you a little story really, but when I worked as a Senko in a large secondary school, I had a really fantastic administrator and she was dyslexic. And we were interviewing for a role in our department and she was setting up the interviews. And it was quite complex because there were 5 candidates and there were 3 tasks that each of the candidates had to undertake. So she set it up on a carousel system, and she also included some of the children because we had our school council and they were part of it. So it was all very complex and she worked really hard on it. She set up all the rooms, she got the children in the right place, she gave us all the documents we needed, there was water in every room. But as we were approaching the time of the interviews, nobody was turning up for the interview. So we're all thinking that's very odd, because sometimes you'll have one person who phones in and says, I can't make it, or I've decided not to interview. But for all of them, it was really unusual. And then the administrator realised that she hadn't actually invited the candidates to come to the interview. So all of her attention had gone into producing a really brilliant plan of the day, but for her, that outcome was very devastating. And we all took it with a pinch of salt and said, don't worry, it was a practice run, you know, next time we'll invite the candidates as well. And we sort of laughed it off, thinking that that was in a way the right way forward, but completely misunderstanding the enormity of that situation for the administrator, because in her mind, she had worked really hard and worked efficiently, and even though she had done all of that, she still didn't get it right. And rather than thinking, as many of us might do, well, I did 90% of it really well, for her, the devastating bit was the 10% that wasn't right. And I think it's really important for us to think about people that we work with. You might be here as an employer today, you might be here as somebody who's an employee with dyslexia. And it's really important for us to put in place the correct support so that we can protect the well-being of our employees. Basically, from that point on, her confidence dropped, and it was a case of having to try to rebuild. She went on to do an absolutely brilliant plan of the day, and we picked a fantastic person, but that wasn't the point for the administrator. So I'm going to take you on to the Equality Act. The Equality Act doesn't specifically mention dyslexia, and it's really important for us to be absolutely clear here that it is covered under the Equality Act. And it is covered because it's a lifelong condition and it affects everyday life. It is one of the most common disabilities that you'll see in the workplace. And in some ways, this can be detrimental because it's so common. 1 in 10 of us are likely to have dyslexia. It can often be overlooked because we feel it's trivial, so we might trivialize it, or we might just overlook it. It is a hidden disability, and for those people who have got a hidden disability, that makes it very difficult because people can't see it, so they can't quantify it in their mind. They can't, it's not concrete, it's an abstract thing, if you like. Dyslexia, oh yeah, that person's got dyslexia. Because of this, it can often be poorly understood, and that often then leads to a lack of adjustments, or ones that are just not effective for the person. And that's the key. I'm just going to go back to the Rose report, although this was really about schools, totally about schools. One of the things that Sir Jim recognised was when he went round schools, he saw lots of interventions, but they weren't necessarily meeting the person's need or the child's need. And it's worth thinking about, if you're an employer and you've put in place things for somebody with dyslexia in your workplace, is it the right thing? Because what we think might be the right thing isn't always right for the person. And it is complex because dyslexia presents, if you like, differently for each person. So somebody might be quite good at reading and very poorly organised, or they might be have quite good organisational skills and poor at reading. Their memory might be poor. So we've got to really think of individuals and how it presents for each person. If you've got dyslexia and you're listening today, the Equality Act protects you because it is considered that you are at a substantial disadvantage to your peers within your workplace. And the aim of the Equality Act is to make things equal. And this is a very interesting concept, because what does equal mean? Does it mean that we're all given the same computer and the same headset, and we're all asked to write the same report? Well, it is fair. We've all got the same computer. We've all got the same headset. Nobody's got a better machine than the other person. But is that equal? It's fair, but is it equal? So I took the time to look up the definition of equal, and one of them was having the resources or the ability to meet a challenge. So let's go back into that scenario. If we're all given the same report to write and the same laptop to use, but one of us is dyslexic, is that an equal situation? Dyslexia affects writing. It doesn't affect the person's ability. So therefore, if we're being asked to write a report, it will put pressure on that one person, because that one aspect, writing, is what their disability is. But if we alleviate writing for that one person, using a piece of software, for instance, then is the playing field more equal, because that person is able to show their ability in putting in the information into the report. And this took me onto a pattern of thought, because last week I co-chaired a panel on spelling, punctuation and grammar. And in the GCSE, some of you may or may not know this, but in the GCSE exams, you're actually graded on spelling, punctuation and grammar as part of your overall GCSE mark. And on the panel, we debated whether this was discrimination for people with dyslexia or not. And we definitely decided it was discrimination for learners with dyslexia. Why is it though? Shouldn't we have good spelling for when we go on to work? If we're going into a job which requires us to write, wouldn't we want that person to have good spelling? So why shouldn't we test that in the GCSE exams? And the answer to that is really clear. We shouldn't be testing spelling because that is associated with that person's disability. So we shouldn't be testing their ability to spell. What we should be testing is their subject matter, and that is their ability. So that's where the distinction is made. We can alleviate those difficulties even in the GCSE exams, and they shouldn't be graded on them. So I'm just going to throw that out there for you, really, because I think it's really important for us to think about sometimes are we actually disabling somebody rather than enabling them? And quite often we do this not intending to. But essentially, the Equality Act replaced the old Disability Act, and it brought together a variety of different acts under one umbrella. So this means if you're an employer today and you're listening, you can't ignore an employee who might come to you and say, I think I'm dyslexic or I am dyslexic. You have to act on that because they are covered within the Equality Act. And equally, if you're an employee listening today, you are protected under that Act, and you can approach your employer and you can ask for some reasonable adjustments to make sure that you can do your job properly. And I just want to explore the definition a little bit more because it is quite interesting. So the wording of the definition of disability has got two words there which I want to look at, and they are substantial and long-term, or long-lasting. And those are mainly in reference to what's called in the Act normal day-to-day activities. So within those two terms, substantial and long-term, the Act states that there are some things you will do on a regular basis, and they actually state reading and writing, following instructions, preparing documents, keeping to a timetable are all listed as examples in the Act as day-to-day activities. When we think about dyslexia, those are key things for individuals with dyslexia that they potentially could struggle with, and that's another indicator that dyslexia is covered under the Equality Act. And normal day-to-day activities is classified in the Act as being carried out by the majority of people, rather than an activity which is specific to you as an individual. So I've already said dyslexia is lifelong. So there's our long term. You know, it's longer than 12 months. You don't just have dyslexia for a month or a couple of months. It is something which you have for your life. And so in that respect, it's easy for employers to understand because, you know, it's a lifelong condition. But substantial is a little bit more complex because it can be quite confusing. Dyslexia and the effects of dyslexia can vary between people. So an example of this is you might have an employee who appears to not have a writing problem, and they produce reports which are good and on a par to others that they're working with. So there again, that reinforces your belief that there isn't a writing problem here for this person. But in a situation where that same person might be put under, for instance, a time pressure, the quality of what they're writing could decline greatly. And that could actually be quite a surprise to you as an employer because it's not something you've experienced from that employee. And I want to just talk to you a little bit about last year. I went to deliver a training, and it was a really interesting training and slightly out of my comfort zone because I was used to working with teachers, but it was for social workers. And the social workers wanted that training on dyslexia because within their offices, they frequently had students who were training to be social workers on placements. And what they noticed was the students that went on to fail were often students that had dyslexia. And so it brought them to a place where they started to think, there's a pattern here. We need to start to unpick this to work out what is happening. So when I was in that training, we began that process of looking into it a little bit more in depth. And what does that really mean? What are some of the common things that you are noticing about the students who have dyslexia, which are leading to them going on to fail? And some of the things that they said was, as a social worker, you very often go to multi-agency meetings that are in different locations with different people. And as the social worker, you might be chairing the meeting, and you might be writing notes, and you might have to then go away and produce minutes or a report from that meeting in quite a quick turnaround. And so as they were talking, I began to understand, well, immediately there are several issues where there's a point of breakdown. So directions, so going to different meetings in different places. Timekeeping can often be an issue, so planning time effectively to get to the meeting on time. Going to an office, and dyslexic or not, we've all turned up at offices and we haven't got a clue in the office where the meeting is being held, and we've been to every floor but the floor where the meeting is. So that isn't dyslexia specific, but it does mean that often we will plan for those things where somebody with dyslexia may not plan some additional time. And then actually taking notes. Taking notes under pressure is quite an interesting thing, because what we're doing, and some of you may be doing this now. So some of you may be taking notes of what I'm saying. So you're listening to what I'm saying and you're actually making notes at the same time. What you're doing there is you're using your working memory. And the working memory is used when we want to complete complex cognitive tasks which are goal oriented. So they end up with a goal. And in this situation, the goal is that you're going to make effective notes, not verbatim of what I'm saying, but good enough for you to go away and be able to look at a later occasion. And that therein, I suppose, lies the issue for the student social workers, that they're accessing their working memory to effectively make notes within a meeting under the pressure of time. And so quite often when they were going away from the meeting, the notes that they had, they couldn't actually make sense of to then write a good enough report within the pressure, again, of more time pressure. So it was almost like a cycle of failure for the students. The other thing that also came to light was that some students could be really good in one setting, but then when they went to another setting, they seemed to be really different. And so we explored that. Their work seemed to be poorer, they seemed to be lacking in confidence. And I've also had queries from people who are in workplace settings where they've got dyslexia and they're working really effectively, and then a change happens. And that change might be that they're required to work across a variety of work settings. And the issue with that is, in a different work setting, the systems are different, and the filing is different, the paperwork is different, where the filing cupboard is different. So everything is different, and we can't just assume, even if you're in an office block and you are in one office and you move to the next office, that the person will make that transition really easily. So we have to think about that in greater detail. And I'm going to take you on to my next slide, which is all about reasonable adjustments. Within the Act, you have a duty as an employer to make reasonable adjustments. So you have to take steps which are reasonable to take in all of the circumstances for that person to avoid disadvantaging them. So in other words, you have to make a reasonable adjustment. And at this point, I just want to say, I wish there was a list that I could produce, that I could say, do all of these things for people with dyslexia in a workplace, and you will have met all of their needs. But there isn't a list. There are lists, but because we are all individual, because we've all got strengths and we've all got different weaknesses and strengths, it's the same for people with dyslexia. So even when you have a list where you think this is a great list of reasonable adjustments, The starting point of working out how best to support someone is to sit down with them and have a conversation, because that person has come through an education system where they've had to survive. And in that process of survival, they will have worked out for themselves some really good strategies. And those strategies, no doubt, they will have brought into the workplace. It doesn't mean that all strategies that they've got are effective, and that's where you've got to get a little bit canny in speaking around effective strategies, because sometimes we stick with a strategy even though it might have worked once and 99 other times it hasn't worked. One of the difficulties that some people with dyslexia might have is thinking through an alternative strategy that is effective. So having the confidence to move from a strategy that isn't effective into one that is. And that can often be a sticking point. So you really need to have a very in-depth conversation about what works for that person, identifying the areas that they're struggling with currently in their workplace, and then thinking through what could be used to enable the best support for them. And the beauty of the age that we live in today, and I know you've got Aaron later, is technology. And, you know, I personally am going to confess to you all, I try to resist technology. But for people with dyslexia, this is the way forwards, even with children with dyslexia. Software packages such as voice to text and text to voice alleviate the reading and writing difficulties that we often see. So those difficulties are what make dyslexia specific, and if we can bring in a package such as voice to text, and voice to text alleviates writing, then why not? Why wouldn't we? That's the big question. We can use our phones to help organise us. And I just want to share a situation that I had last year. I upgraded my iPhone, I was delighted. And my son said to me, oh, you can use your calendar on your phone and you can put in all of your meetings and your appointments. So great, I said to him, that's fantastic. And set him up with the task of organising my calendar. And he did what he had to do, where he linked it to my work emails. And I thought, this is a great solution. But the thing that I hadn't factored in, which is a really basic thing, and because I'm not too phone savvy, is I actually had to look at the phone to see what I was doing every day. And it seems such a basic thing. And I did think at the time, why didn't I look at the phone? It's all there for me. It pings up little reminders. But year 2 of the calendar system, I can actually tell you I'm looking at my phone. I've got it next to me all the time and it pings up little reminders of what I'm doing when I'm doing it. So it's a really effective system on the 2nd year for me. But these are all the things that we can actually access ourselves. And as employers, you know, these things are free. Not all software is free, but some is. And so it's worth looking into it and thinking, what could we do? Also, is it an adjustment that you could make across the whole of your workplace? So you establish it as normal working practice for everybody, rather than singling out somebody and saying, oh, well, that's what we do for the people with dyslexia, we do this. So try to look and make it a much more consistent practice. One of my frustrations as a secondary school teacher around the use of software was that we just didn't use it enough in secondary schools, and it still is an ongoing problem. So really, if our young people can make it through secondary school, and hopefully progress into either further education or higher education, then they will be able to access hardware and software which alleviates their difficulties and lets them show what their real potential is. I think the main point about reasonable adjustments for me is that it is a cost to the employer. But more importantly, if you don't make that cost, it's a cost to the employee. So if you don't make reasonable adjustments for people, they pick up the emotional cost of it. And that's worse for the organisation and for the individual. And we have to think, what constitutes reasonable? Because, you know, many of the adjustments that are needed are software, and that, as I've said, they do have a cost. But there is a variety which is free, and we know that cost is falling on some where other software is being produced. But the major game changer, I think, often is extra time. And this is an area where you can explore with your employee what are the benefits of extra time, and what do we mean by extra time? Because extra time can be as simple as leaving a gap after instructions for the employee to process what you've said and what they've got to do next. That can be a reasonable adjustment if you know that somebody just needs that extra few minutes. And I'll share another story about my son. I remember every parents' evening I attended for my son, teachers always said to me, he's the last person to start the task in the class. He always takes 5 minutes before starting. He never starts at the same time as everybody else. And I always felt that it was meant as a negative thing, that actually what they were saying is everybody else starts straight away apart from him. So what's wrong with him? Why isn't he starting at the same time as everyone else? But actually, when I've thought about that as an adult, if we're given an instruction in a workplace, do we jump up straight away and start writing or start doing, or do we actually take our time to think about what we've been asked to do, to plan it properly before we undertake what that task is? And when I rationalised it in that way, I realised for my son, perhaps what he was doing was something which the school should have been preparing everybody for, trying to take on board what it is that they're being asked to do. And I think it's really important that we leave some time for employees to think and to process. And we can build this in different ways. So it can be verbally in a conversation. You can back something up visually. So if it's a complex task, you can say what the task is. You can back it up with some visual instructions, and you can even show this is how you do this thing. So modeling what it is. And I think all of these things are reasonable adjustments that are free, but take time for you as employers to think, what are the needs of your employees? Do they need that level of input, or do they just need to have something visually presented to them? You can only find those things out if you take the time to have a really good conversation. I think visually, most of us probably feel that we are much more effective when we can see something. And I think that is, you know, most people do say, oh, I'm a visual learner. And I think really when we think about our senses, what we advocate when we're teaching children is that it's a multi-sensory approach. So we don't just go for one approach, but that we actually incorporate multiple senses at the same time. So we might be saying, we might be showing, we might be doing. And it's good to just carry that through into a workplace, because it just reinforces exactly what it is. If you have an expectation as an employer, you can't just expect that your employee is going to know what the outcome is that you're expecting. You have to make that really clear, and perhaps you have to make clear what the steps are to get from A to B. And those would be considered reasonable adjustments. So I'm going to move on to really what we do at the BDA, and it's very exciting. I mean, you've got Donna speaking to you later. We do so much at the British Dyslexia Association, but one of the things that we do is a quality mark for the workplace. So I want to talk to you about that because I think it's a really good way forward if you're listening as an employee and if you're listening as an employer. The question is really, what is the quality mark and why should you consider doing it? So the quality mark really was designed to help employers think about the work practices in your own organisations and across organisations. So what we've developed is a set of standards in the quality mark which enables you as an organisation to put in place some of those systems which are dyslexia friendly. So what you're trying to achieve is that awareness throughout your organisation of being dyslexia aware, dyslexia friendly. So everything that you do in your workplace, you embed those thoughts in your mind. Is this dyslexia friendly? It is a transformative process. So if you do think, if you're listening and you think, oh, this could be really good for our workplace, we're really keen, you have to really, before you start, you have to be in that headspace where you say to yourself, this is going to involve at some level change and transformation. And it might be that it's a small change, it might be that it's a really big change, but that transformation at the end means that what you're doing is you're putting in place work systems which are beneficial for everybody, not just for people with dyslexia. So the first thing really that I want to say is it's not easy. And I hope I'm not saying that and putting you off, but I'm just trying to prepare you for that transformational work. It's not a tick box exercise, but it is a commitment that you're saying as an organisation that you're going to commit yourselves from the bottom to the top, to the top to the bottom in your organisation, everybody, everything that you do. So what do you have to do? Because I've made it really enormous now and you're all probably there thinking, gosh, that's a massive piece of work. I'll just talk to you about some of the things that you might have to do. And as you're listening, I think it's really important that perhaps maybe you think, where are you at the moment? Because some of these things, they might not be an enormous leap for you. So you have to consider, what support do you put in place for employees with dyslexia? Have you got some policies and procedures which support and promote dyslexia in your organisation? And there can be a range of things that fit into that. You can have some drop-in sessions, you could focus on well-being, you could promote dyslexia in a staff newsletter. So it doesn't have to be an enormous thing, but it has to be something that you consistently do in order to support and promote dyslexia. And the other thing is, how do you quality assure your communications and your materials? That's really important because sometimes we might think we're doing something to support people. I can't think what, let's just pluck something out of the air. We might increase our font size, but perhaps it's more than just that. So perhaps what we have to do as well is also think about the font. Is it the right font in our materials, on our website? So that's all around communication, but also within this, the first section of the quality mark, have you considered how you recruit people and the recruitment process? Is it accessible for people with dyslexia? Do you say to people, we will make reasonable adjustments for you in the recruitment process if they declare to you that they're dyslexic? How do they know that they can say that to you? I think a good question to ask is your organisation appealing to somebody with dyslexia as an employee? So if I had dyslexia and I was thinking of coming to your organisation, what would it be about your organisation that would make me think this is a place where I could flourish? So how do you let it be known to people with dyslexia that we are a good employer and will support you? I've talked about assistive technology, so software and some hardware, but one of the strands focuses on communication and organisation. So at the British Dyslexia Association, we've got a style guide which we encourage you to use. And the challenge with that particular strand, because there are 4 strands within the quality mark, is that you have to consider accessibility. And how accessible are your systems for people with dyslexia? Who checks those systems and how often are they checked? And what do you do if you find out that your systems are not accessible for somebody with dyslexia? How do you know how to change it? You can demonstrate within that strand in many ways. So you could have testimonials of people who have been implementing that support. You could have a buddy system to support someone when they're learning new systems. You can change your systems to make them easier for people with dyslexia. And I think it's really good to collect testimonials from your staff, because they are the people that will tell you what they've done and how they've changed things in your organisation. And I guess I'm going to set you all a challenge, and I'm going to say to you, perhaps before you even consider doing the quality mark, perhaps take a journey through your organisation as somebody with dyslexia, and see what is it like. That will give you a good idea of where you might be doing things really well, or where you might be doing things that need to change a little bit. So what are the next steps? Where can you go from here? If you're interested in the quality mark, I think one of the essential things is that you have to identify somebody within your organisation that's going to be the key point of reference. So they're going to be the person that organises all the change. If you want to consider it, you can always talk to myself, and you can always talk to Donna, and undertake the journey. If you know somebody within your organisation who's dyslexic, ask them to engage in that exercise with you. How easy did they find it from recruitment right through to being an employee? What is it like at your organisation? And I think that'll give you some really concrete information, and it will help you to answer what you do next from that point. So I think really I've finished speaking now.
That's good.
Yes, I mean, I could talk forever, but yeah, I think my next slide is any questions?
That is most appreciated. So what we're going to do is that we haven't really got time for questions, because our next session will be starting in 10 minutes, and I have to close one session to get to the next session.
Sorry.
But someone has just said there, no question, but fantastic, thank you. There has been a few questions. What I'm going to do to the people that have asked questions, I will send them to Gillian, because I can export them later. So don't worry too much about it if we don't get a response. It may take a couple of days. Can you just give us, are you okay to give out your email address so if people do want to contact you? Is that all right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Would you like me to say it?
Yes, please. That'd be really useful. Yes.
Yeah. It's Gillian with a G, A, at bdadyslexia.org.uk. You can go on the website and you'll see it there as well.
That's most appreciated, and a really interesting talk about the BDA and what you're doing and the concepts of it. I think there's some really there has been some comments and questions which I think have been really useful. I think I'm actually going to just ask you this question you think there. So, and this is your thoughts. We've got 2 minutes to answer it though. Are individuals who have not been tested or given the condition of dyslexia, are they covered under the Equality Act?
I think if you have that conversation with your employer to say you think that you are dyslexic, you are letting your employer know that you feel that you have some difficulties, whether you've got an assessment or not. I think you are sharing that information with your employer, and they have to do something for you.
Yeah, and I will make one additional point to that is, according to Access to Work, which is the government scheme that supports people with a disability, they do not ask for proof. They do not ask for proof. They just ask for what you feel your condition is. and how it affects you. They do not ask for proof. So that could help with that as well. Thank you, Gillian, for an amazing
Thank you,
conversation.
everybody.
I'm going to end the session now. I look forward to seeing you all back in about 5 to 10 minutes time for our next session. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. I'm going to end the session for everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.